Hello friends, I'm FIDE instructor Atul Dahale and welcome to my YouTube channel. Today we are going to see yet another instructive game, and this time it is all about Rook Endgame. Yes, in this game, which was played in the year of 1890, quite long back, Tarrasch demonstrated that how to play when you have an active rook. Yes, after some middle game strategical play, he got one extra pawn, and after getting the extra pawn, he kept on pressurizing opponent with his active king and the active rook. So it is a bliss to watch this game how he played. So that's why it is termed as one of the most instructive rook end games ever played in the history of chess. Okay, so without further delay, we'll be getting just to the game, but before we go further, I would like to tell you that don't forget to like this video and subscribe to my channel if you are new here. So in this game, Tarrasch was white, he played e4. His opponent Thorold Manchester was black, he played e6. French defense d4, d5, knight d2. Well, this is a very standard way to play nowadays, we know this thing, and I'll be going a little bit more quickly through the opening and middle game phase because I want to show you the beauty of the end game in this game. Okay, so don't really rush or anything, stay with me and enjoy this beautiful game. Okay, so c5, black played this move, white played e into d5, queen into d5. Well, there is another very important opening trick which you should know, that if black plays c into d4, then it is a little bit inaccurate move because we can play bishop b5 check, bishop d7. Capturing the pawn on e6 is a good idea because after bishop to b5, f into e into f7 check, king into f7, and now queen h5 check, g6, and we will be picking up the bishop on b5. Here in this position, white is obviously much more better because the king can castle, the pawn on d4 is a weakness, plus the king on f7 is not having that good day. Okay, so queen into d5 was played, and now white plays knight g f3. He is giving up the pawn on d4, which was played in the game, c into d4, but this is the temporary sacrifice you can say, because white can play bishop c4, then queen h5 and castle. By giving one pawn, he has got 3 active pieces, plus his king is also safe, plus the other rook which was sleeping on the h1 square, he is also ready to come in the game. Okay, so black played knight c6, obviously white plays knight b3 going for the pawn on d4 here. Okay, one more thing I would like to tell you, that e5 is not a good idea because white can simply capture the pawn on e5, because after queen into e5, rook e1 is a pin and white will be winning the queen. So that is not good idea. Knight c6 was played, knight b3. Again after e5, white has that good idea, that is knight into e5, and now the queen on h5 is also hanging, means there is no longer knight into e5 possible because queen into h5 is there. Okay, so here queen into d1 was played, and now white played rook into d1, knight takes e5, and now white plays simple move rook to e1, pinning the knight on e5. Okay, so black needs to play f6, white attacks the knight, and now he plays bishop to b4, attacking the rook. Now white needs to play one important move here, that is bishop to d2. If he doesn't play rook to bishop to d2, and if he plays rook e2, thinking that on the next move he is going to capture on e5, it is not a good idea because after bishop g4, the rook is not having any good squares. He has only one square, that is on e4, and if he goes there, then bishop f5, and the game might end in a draw because of repetition of moves. Okay, so bishop d2 was almost forced, and then black captured here, knight takes d2, and now he plays bishop to f5. The pawn on c2 is being attacked, so here he first plays f into e5. Obviously black cannot capture it back because rook into e5 will be played, and the bishop on f5 is in big trouble, so knight e7 is the only move, and then we can play rook a e1, followed by we will be capturing the knight on e7, so white will be piece up. So that is not a good move from black. Black played long castle, and now here, without hurrying for some moves like e into f6, which will allow black to get a piece into the game very quickly, he plays a move which is very simple, and he exchanges his opponent active piece. Okay, so this is a very important thing which you should remember, that if it's possible for you, try to exchange your opponent's active pieces. So white plays bishop d3, then after bishop into d3, c into d3, he opens up one file for his rook. Okay, as this game is going to be very important rook end game, so pay attention to this thing, like rook belongs to open files, and whenever you get the chance to put your rook on the open file or on the 7th rank, then you should put it. Okay, so f into e5, then rook a c1. This is a very important inclusive move which gains lot of activity also. Now your rook is on the open file. Okay, you could have captured rook into e5, that was also a possibility, but black will play knight f6 and he will get one piece in the game. So before he gets the piece in the game, you should play one simple move, rook a c1, which is a useful move. Now black can play king d7, but it will be a little bit cramped position for the king because it will be hammered by these two rooks, and the pawn on d4 is also going to fall. Let's suppose black plays king d6, then we can play this, and after king d5, rook c4, and the pawn on d4 will be falling very soon, and that is not a good idea. So he plays king to b8. Now rook into e5 was played, knight comes on f6, and now in order to grab the e file, he plays rook to e1, rook h e8. There happens like two rooks are exchanged here, and knight into e8 was played by black. Okay, what happens if he plays rook into e8 is that we can play rook into e8, knight into e8, and then knight b3. The knight will be taking the pawn on d4 and white will be pawn up. Okay, it eventually the pawn on d4 is going to fall because it is very weak pawn, but it will take some time. So here the rook, now as I said, like if you get the chance, put your rook on the open file or on the 7th rank. So that's why he plays rook to e7. I have analyzed one more game related to this thing, like why rook on the 7th rank is very important, that is Capablanca versus Tartakower. If you are not seen that game, please do check out that game in my channel. Okay, so black plays a6, getting some room for the king, and now knight b3. Another idea is like, okay, knight is jumping on the a5 square, attacking the b7 pawn, and there is one hidden idea related to the pawn on d4. We will be looking at that thing. So here black played b6, and he thought like, okay, my position is little bit defended here and I can survive for after some time. Maybe his idea is to play something like king to c8 followed by rook d7, but white was very alert in this position. Tarrasch played knight into d4, getting one pawn in this rook endgame. Okay, he captured here, and after rook into e8, king c7, he came back with rook to e7. Now he is pawn up in this position, and the way he played after this is also very instructive. Okay, how he played is very important, and pay attention to this thing. So he played king d7. Now it's time to bring your king in the game, so he plays king f2. Black played g6 move. By playing g6 move, the pawn on h7 is little bit weak, so he attacks the pawn on h7. Now when the pawn on h7 goes forward, the pawn on g6 becomes weak, and now before he attacks the pawn with rook g3, first of all he brings the king in the game. This very important thing which you should always remember about the endgame. In endgame, the rook means, especially when the rook is active, you should not forget about your king, because king is also very important piece when it comes to the end game. So you should activate your king and try to get it in the central square, like center of the board, as quickly as possible. So black played rook d6, and now he pushed the pawn. Now finally the pawn is ready to be pushed. He gives this check, king d3, and now rook e1. After rook e1, okay, black is trying to get his rook to b1 and attack this pawns or something like that. So Tarrasch was very clever. He played rook g3, attacking the pawn on g6. Now rook b1 is no longer a possibility, because after king c2, the rook will be attacked. Wherever the rook moves, it doesn't matter, because we can just capture the pawn on g6, and white will be 2 pawns up. So that dream of getting back behind the rook behind the passed pawn is not going to work out. So he plays rook to e6. Now it's time to dislodge this rook from that square. So he plays rook e3. Obviously any rook pawn endgame is completely lost for black here, so he did not go for it. He played rook to d6, and now rook e5. He is improving his rook position. Now the king is also ready to come in the game with king to e4 square, rook f6. Now the rook is going to come on the 7th rank. Okay, whenever it comes, we can always play rook e2, and the rook will be forced to go back, but he wants to improve his position. So he plays a4, getting rid of all his pawns on the 2nd rank. Then rook f2 was played. He plays rook e2, dislodging this rook. Rook goes back, and now he plays b4. At least now in this position there is no backward pawn, you can say. All the pawns are advancing in this position, and now he plays rook to f1. Now he plays rook e5, another good idea. Here one thing is that if you play rook b1, then white can play b5, followed by he has this rook g5 attacking the pawn on g6, which will be a very difficult position for black. And if he plays rook a1, the same way he can play a5. After this capture, the pawn on g6 is a big weakness. So he plays rook f2, trying to attack the pawn on g2, and now he plays simply rook to g5. As there are no pawns here, he doesn't need to play rook to e2 square. He plays rook g5. Now the rook is asked to go back with rook f6, and this is the funny part. He now plays very simple move h3. He's improving his piece position and pawn position slowly and gradually. King d6. Now it's time to bring the king up. He plays this check. Now rook e5. He is not going back in this position. Rook f6, and yet another good move in this position, that is d5. Here the next idea is to play rook e6 at any point. Okay, so let's suppose I'll just show you, like if h4 is played, then white has the idea of playing rook g5 followed by rook g4, and the pawn on h4 will be falling. And if he plays something else, let's suppose he plays a5 kind of a move, then after b into a5, one idea can be to play rook e6 going into the pawn endgame, because pawn endgame will be completely winning for white, because even if he tries to stop this thing, it is not going to stop, because white has this h4 move and these two pawns will be frozen. Now black needs to play king b6, then king d5, and he will be winning the pawn for sure on a5. And we know this thing that outside passed pawn is a big thing for you. We will be going towards this pawn on g6, capture this pawns, and the pawn will be queening very soon. So that idea of converting the game into pawn endgame is there after d5. So black plays king d7, and now rook g5, attacking the pawn on g6. King d6 was played. Now it's time to bring the rook from the other side. So he plays rook g3. Only the threat is like rook c3 followed by rook c6 is the threat. So he plays king e7, and now he doesn't need to go anywhere, so he plays rook f3. Now the rook is not having any good squares, only one square is d6, and we already saw this thing that if rook into f3, this kind of pawn endgame happens, then white is definitely winning in this position, no doubt about it. So he doesn't play that move. He played rook to d6, and now king comes up. So slowly and gradually you can see that white has improved his pawn position, piece position, and his king is very active. Plus the pawn on d file is also pushing forward. After rook d8, he plays another good move. He's not afraid to go into the pawn endgame. He plays d6 check, because if you play rook into d6, it will be a big blunder, because after rook f7, king into f7, king into d6 followed by king will be coming here, getting these pawns, and white's pawns are much more faster and white will win. So he did not play that move. He played king d7. I can tell you is already all over. He goes for rook f7 check, king goes to c8 square, another check, king to b8, and now he plays rook to c2. Now the king on b8 is completely shut down from the game. It is cut off, you can say. Now it's time from king to come up. Even he can capture the pawn on g6 also, otherwise he'll just king comes to e7, d7, and d8 will be queening. So black played rook e8 check, king f6, b5. Okay, he doesn't need to capture the pawn on b5. He plays a simple move d7, rook to h8, now king e7, rook h7 check, and now king to d6, rook h2, rook h8, and now what will you play? You want to queen the pawn? A very simple idea, rook to e2. And finally in this position, Tarrasch opponent resigned. So this was a very beautiful game in which Tarrasch played in a very smooth way, right? So it was like as if he was showing his friend how to win in the rook endgame when you have one extra pawn. So I hope you enjoyed this instructive rook endgame. The way he built up the position was really beautiful. And once more, I would like to tell you that if you like this video, don't forget to like this video and share it with your friends also, and subscribe to my channel if you are new here. We will be meeting very soon with some new interesting video. Till then, take care and goodbye.